Hi, this is Autumn Greenhill, and here's my presentation on the competence to plead guilty. When on trial, everyone has the right to plead not guilty or guilty. When you are pleading not guilty, you are saying, no, I did not do the crime. I did not commit whatever crime you were on trial for. Compared to guilty, you are pleading guilty. You are saying, I did commit this crime and I take the consequences for whatever happens because I am guilty. These pleas occur at plea hearing. These plea hearings are often short, and the judge answers the defendant a series of questions. Usually they're pretty short questions, yes or no answers, that kind of thing. During the plea hearing, the judge is collecting all that information, the legal team is collecting the information, and the judge will make the determination on the plea. The judge will also determine if the plea is the best interest for the defendant. If the judge doesn't believe that it's in the best interest, they have the right to deny the plea and they can say, no, we do not accept your guilty plea. Along with that, if a defendant is saying they want to plead guilty to whatever crime it is, the defendant or the judge must explain to the defendant all of the consequences. They will share every consequence that will come with the action of pleading guilty. Along with that, a lot of guilty pleas are reached through the plea bargaining process. The legal team and like the judge will come up with a plea bargain saying if you plead guilty, you'll have a lesser sentence. You won't be put up for the death penalty if it's legal, that kind of thing. So defendants will plead guilty if they want a shorter sentence or whatever the plea bargain may be. It just makes it a little bit better of a scenario, a better consequence compared to pleading not guilty. You may not have as good of a sentence. Along with that, the Supreme Court has different rules that are put into play to ensure that the defendant knows what they're doing, and they have to understand multiple different aspects of the criminal process before they are allowed to put in their plea. The Supreme Court has three main aspects that the defendant must understand. The first one being the nature of the charge. They have to understand what the charge is. Along with that, they have to understand the penalties associated with the charge. They must understand the sentence, any other rules that they may have, anything like that, or even like probation rules. They have to understand those. Along with that, when you do plead guilty, rights are waived. So the defendant must understand that they are going to lose some of their rights or the rights are going to be waived if they put in the plea of guilt. There are four different rights that are waived when the plea of guilt happens. The first one being the right to remain silent. Everyone knows that that is just a normal American law stated by the Constitution. However, if you plead guilty, you lose the right to remain silent. Along with that, you lose the right to confront one's accusers. You often don't go on trial, and you won't see, let's say if it was like a sexual assault case, you may not be able to see who accused you of performing that. Along with that, you lose the right to a jury trial, and then the right to trial counsel. Okay, additionally, when a defendant wants to plead guilty, they have to undergo different assessments to ensure that they are competent and understand the consequences of a guilty plea. There are different assessments that may be used for each different defendant based on their needs, what the guilty plea may be, what the crime committed was. Those assessments are tailored to each person to ensure that everyone has the most up-to-date information on their mental status along with their competence. A little while ago, there was a case where the Supreme Court was trying to say, oh, well, if someone pleads guilty, they need to be more competent than someone who is standing trial. However, this is not the case. They did rule that a defendant who pleads guilty does not need to be more competent than someone who stands trial. If they're pleading guilty, they do still need to be competent, but they don't need to be more competent than someone who is standing trial and going through all of those. Along with that, the defendant must be questioned about the understanding of their rights. If the defendant does not understand their rights when they plead guilty, they are not able to put in their plea of guilt. They have to ensure that the defendant knows exactly what they're pleading guilty to. They understand what the consequences is, what rights may be lost. They also just need to understand that they have the right to a lawyer and they have the right to not plead guilty and to go to trial. All of those things, the defendant will be questioned about that to ensure that they understand what they are pleading guilty to. Along with that, the defendant also needs to understand the proceedings. They need to understand what is going to happen once they plead guilty. If they don't understand that, they may not understand the consequences of the plea of guilt. They have to understand what may happen after they plead guilty, what the consequences, the sentencing, all of that may be. The judge will ensure that they put out that information to ensure that the defendant knows exactly what they're pleading for and what may happen once they put in their plea of guilt. Along with that, the defendant, some people may struggle with a mental illness, and that can affect their autonomy. If their autonomy is impaired due to a mental illness, the judge may rule that they are not competent to plead guilty. If their autonomy is impaired, they may not understand exactly what's going on, and that they may be making these decisions just based on what someone else is saying, rather than their own autonomy choosing to put in that plea. Along with that, they often see psychiatrists, and if the psychiatrist believes that, or even like a psychologist, if they believe that they are not competent to plead guilty, they will tell the judge that and the legal team, hey, I do not believe they're competent. They should not be putting in the plea of guilt because they don't exactly understand what's going on, or they may just be choosing that because everyone is telling them to. Okay, so I chose an article. It is about 26 pages long. It is pretty long. It's Competence to Plead Guilty, a New Standard. I believe that the whole article is beneficial to the understanding of the competence to plead guilty. Although it is 26 pages, every single page goes over different standards for the competence to plead guilty. They also discuss a lot of different cases that have gone over with the competence to plead guilty, where certain defendants may or may not have been competent to plead guilty, or they had to go through different psychiatric assessments just to understand what exactly they were pleading to. The article also states a lot of different scenarios where things may need to be tweaked based on the defendant. They go over different cases where one defendant needed this, and then another case that didn't matter in that case. It goes over a lot of different things like that. And I think it's really important to understand that every defendant is different and that the standards may need to be adjusted based on who the defendant is, what their case may be, and even what the crime was. If they're going up on like a murder trial, obviously that's a very serious trial, or even a sexual assault, compared to like a minor civil law case. It's just really important to understand what exactly the crime committed was, whether or not the competence to plead guilty is acceptable for that specific defendant. As for my discussion question, I went over a few different questions and I was trying to get one that would give like the most thinking process involved in it. The discussion question I decided on is, what is the importance of determining competency before allowing a defendant to plead guilty? I believe this will give a good short answer because you have to understand why it is so important for someone to be competent before putting in the plea guilty or a plea of guilt. You really have to put some thinking processes into this, and it'll help determine why the defendant may be able to plead guilty or why it may not be. And then here is my reference for the textbook. Thank you guys for listening, and I hope you enjoyed it.